Have you ever felt a sudden chill, as though ancient voices were whispering through time, the moment you gazed at a centuries-old painting of the end times or read a verse hinting at cataclysmic events that defy human understanding? Tonight, I invite you to step into that mystery. Let us draw aside the veil that separates our modern lives from the haunting signs, symbols, and revelations recorded in sacred scripture. We will examine verses from the Bible that foretell immense upheaval, wars, earthquakes, plagues, and we will explore the depiction of a figure whose hair is white like wool and whose feet are like bronze. Together, we will unravel how these visions intersect with hidden perspectives on Africa and its people, underscoring truths that have been eclipsed by centuries of narrow interpretations. Far from sowing division, let us unify in our quest for a deeper understanding of the text that has guided countless generations, whether in times of celebration or in days of doubt. If you have ever wondered whether our world is heading toward a monumental shift, or if certain voices have been stifled within biblical history, gather your courage and stay with me. For what awaits may challenge what you believe about our past, our present, and our future. Although the book of Revelation has long captivated people with its vivid imagery, one particular passage remains exceptionally perplexing. It is found in Revelation 1, verses 14 to 15. Rendered here in the King James Version, his head and his hairs were white like wool, as white as snow, and his eyes were as a flame of fire, and his feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, and his voice as the sound of many waters. Traditionally, many have focused on the symbolism of this description, attributing its dramatic tones to the apocalyptic style of literature. Yet for others, it raises a crucial point about how biblical figures, particularly Christ, have been portrayed throughout history. The text references wool and brass, which can invite associations with texture and color far removed from the standard European imagery. In ancient Christian art across Africa, depictions of biblical figures often mirror darker skin tones, reflecting a cultural familiarity that diverged from later European renderings. Some consider these alternative images to be closer to the literal sense of Revelation's description. For centuries, however, these African perspectives were overshadowed or dismissed in mainstream theology and art, leaving a vital question unanswered. Did colonial and Eurocentric biases rewrite certain facets of Scripture's visual legacy? In this exploration, we will not claim that a single culture alone holds the key to interpreting these majestic symbols. Instead, we venture forth with open minds, seeking to understand how different people across time and space have read the same sacred text. The question is especially poignant for Black communities and others of African descent. Many have scoured the pages of the Bible, yearning to find representation that aligns with their own likeness. Such desire is not about excluding others, but about claiming space in a narrative that should, in theory, welcome every tribe and nation. Revelation 1, verses 14 to 15, with its references to wool, like hair and bronze, like feet, has served as a beacon for some who felt alienated by the abundance of paintings and sculptures portraying biblical figures with fair skin and straight hair. Indeed, Christian art from Ethiopia, Eritrea, Egypt, and other parts of the African continent offers a robust counterpoint to the European standard that pervaded much of the globe. Many African believers have drawn comfort and affirmation from these images, seeing in them reflections of their own heritage that mainstream Christianity often failed to provide. There are those who argue that the descriptions in Revelation were never intended to denote ethnicity. In this view, white like wool refers more to a dazzling purity than any literal hair texture, while feet like unto fine brass, as if they burned in a furnace, is meant to convey divine glory, rather than a physical complexion. They support their claims with the broader context of apocalyptic writing. Revelation teems with metaphors that defy simple interpretation, such as dragons, multi-horned beasts, and streets of gold. This style, they suggest, is purely symbolic. Still, others challenge that assumption, pointing to parallel descriptions in Daniel 7, verse 9, where the Ancient of Days is depicted with hair like the pure wool, and to Song of Solomon 1. Verse 5, I am black, but comely. They ask whether these verses might suggest that biblical lands included peoples with features we often associate with Africa or the Middle East. The controversy is real and has lingered for generations, especially under the shadow of colonial history. During the era of European expansion, Christian teachings often accompanied conquest, and the imagery presented to colonized peoples was invariably European. This contributed to a global assumption that Jesus, the prophets, and the patriarchs all looked distinctly Western, repeated so often that it became a kind of default. While countless artifacts and icons from early African Christian communities remained localized or dismissed as anomalies. Some of this dismissal was deliberate, fueled by racial prejudice. Other times, it was a side effect of ignorance or a lack of scholarly interest. In any case, it led to a notion that Africa held a peripheral role in shaping Christianity, an idea now being dismantled by ongoing research and archaeological findings. For example, Ethiopia's Christian heritage dates back to the Acts of the Apostles, where a man of high position under Queen Candace is baptized by Philip. That moment, recorded in Acts 8, verses 26 to 39, reveals that Africa was within the earliest reach of Christianity, possibly even before it took root in parts of Europe. These revelations become doubly intriguing when we look at the biblical signs of the end times mentioned in Matthew 24. In this chapter, Jesus speaks of wars, famines, pestilences, and false prophets, raising questions that every generation grapples with. Each era wonders if the final hour is near, especially when wars and disasters abound. Yet time after time, the world endures. The 20th century, marked by 2 global wars and countless regional conflicts, seem to fulfill grim prophecies, while the 21st century continues with pandemics and upheavals. Closely related warnings appear in Ezekiel, where severe judgments mirror the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Revelation 6:3, conquest, war, famine, and death. Prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel weave a tapestry of end-time visions that resonate across both Old and New Testaments. Daniel 7, verse 9 again references hair white like pure wool, echoing Revelation's imagery of a figure radiant with wisdom and authority. Some argue these descriptions transcend ethnicity, while others see literal hints of features prevalent in Africa or the Middle East. Historically, those controlling theological narratives often imposed a narrow portrayal of biblical figures, reinforcing their cultural and political dominance. Indigenous African depictions of Christ were labeled unorthodox, pushing them to the margins of accepted Christian art. Over the centuries, this gave rise to the idea that the biblical story was inherently European in appearance. Meanwhile, many African Christians preserved their own imagery in secret or local contexts, resisting cultural erasure. In modern times, as African nations, regained sovereignty, and African theologians gained recognition. These once suppressed traditions came to light, illuminating a Christian heritage untouched by colonial interpretations. Revelation 1 and Daniel 7 found renewed significance among believers eager to see themselves represented in Scripture. None of this invalidates symbolic readings of apocalyptic texts, for Scripture is replete with metaphors. Fire symbolizing judgment, water hinting at chaos or cleansing, and metals representing refined faith. However, the question remains whether a purely symbolic approach has conveniently hidden any non-European portrait of Christ. This possibility energizes many modern Christians of all backgrounds to re-examine the text through a broader lens. They seek a Christ who resonates with diverse cultures, rather than one constrained by centuries of Eurocentric tradition. Turning again to the end times prophecies, we see denominations that predict a strict timeline: rapture, tribulation, second coming, while others interpret these warnings as cyclic patterns recurring throughout history. Wars, famines, and natural disasters have long haunted humanity, though the scale and speed of modern crises raise fresh alarms. Rapid global communication amplifies every calamity, fueling the sense that prophecy is unfolding in real time. Many point to Matthew 24, verse 33. When we shall see all these things. It is near, even at the doors, as a call to spiritual vigilance. The immediacy of such warnings can be sobering or galvanizing, yet amidst the anxiety, the question of inclusive biblical imagery resurfaces. If every nation is to face the end times, then every nation's place in the scriptural record must be acknowledged. From the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts, to Simon of Cyrene who carried Christ's cross, to North African church fathers like Augustine, Africa's role is undeniable. Yet many remained unaware of these truths because a uniform, westernized portrayal of holy figures had dominated global consciousness. When Revelation 1 mentions wool, like hair, and brass, like feet, it resonates profoundly for those marginalized by selective teaching. Throughout history, vested interests maintained a homogenized image of Christ to uphold societal hierarchies, but hidden art and manuscripts reveal a broader legacy that includes Africa. Modern discoveries expose just how vibrant and diverse early Christian expression was. These finds debunk the notion that Africa was peripheral, illustrating that from ancient times, believers on the continent cultivated their own theological perspectives and artworks. This shift toward inclusivity need not deny the symbolic significance of Revelation. Rather, it counters the assumption that every description was purely metaphorical, urging us to consider how racial or cultural biases may have shaped theology. And time events remain a subject of debate. Some see them as imminent, others as patterns repeating throughout history. Yet the global scope of modern crisis prompts many to ponder whether the final chapters are indeed unfolding. Nonetheless, the universal message of redemption calls for unity, where no people group is excluded. If the end times is for all humanity, the biblical images leading there must likewise reflect the breadth of God's creation. It is in this convergence of prophecy and cultural inclusion that we find hope for a more integrated understanding. If we are indeed moving toward an era of great trials, unity becomes paramount, and recognizing Africa's rightful place in Scripture strengthens that unity. People who have been marginalized by historical forces yearn to see themselves in the sacred narrative they cherish. This longing need not be divisive when approached with respect. nor should a symbolic approach negate the possibility of a non-European Christ. Multiple perspectives do not diminish Scripture's sanctity. Rather, they highlight its capacity to speak across cultures and epochs. The mention of wool, like hair, and feet like brass resonates, especially with believers of African heritage, without negating its deeper symbolism for others. By admitting these verses could carry literal undertones, reflecting African features, we do not exclude other representations. We merely broaden the lens to see the fullness of biblical reality. Revelation does not end in destruction, but in the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. Revelation 21, verses 1 to 2. There, love, justice, and unity prevail, where earthly divisions dissolve in the presence of God. For those who felt hidden or marginalized, this unity is a powerful message of acceptance, reminding us that Africa and its people have never been an afterthought in God's unfolding plan. Colonial and racial politics once obscured Africa's role in church history. Yet archaeological work and modern scholarship reveal a vibrant tapestry of African Christianity stretching back to the earliest centuries. This is no modern invention, but a reclaiming of long suppressed realities. Early theologians like Augustine, Tertullian, and Origen hailed from North Africa, shaping Christian doctrine for centuries to come. Ethiopia's rock-hewn churches and Egypt's Coptic tradition stand as living witnesses to Africa's foundational place in the faith. Re-examining Revelation 1, verses 14 to 15 through an African lens does not diminish Christ's universality. It expands our collective appreciation. Art and interpretation must welcome every cultural expression, for the gospel transcends borders and ethnic lines. Meanwhile, the end times passages continue to generate both fervor and doubt. Some believe history is marching toward a climax. Others see repeated cycles of tragedy and renewal. But all can agree that vigilance, humility, and love are the qualities Scripture upholds in any age. If the last days indeed draw near, a church divided by race or culture will be ill prepared for the trials ahead. Only by recognizing and honoring the fullness of our shared Christian heritage can believers stand unified in the face of tribulation. The question of who obscured Africa's role is complex. Colonial powers, biased missionaries, theologians bound by racial prejudice, and sheer inertia all played a part. Yet blaming the past accomplishes little without the will to restore what was lost and reconcile what remains broken. We can begin that restoration by sharing these perspectives, studying early African Christian art, exploring theological works from across the continent, and raising awareness in our communities. Such dialogue respects the genuine breadth of Scripture and the dignity of every culture involved in God's story. Above all, this endeavor is not about discarding one tradition for another, but about shining light into neglected corners of biblical history. When approached with humility, each conversation about Revelation 1's wool, like hair, and bronze, like feet, can lead us toward a greater reverence for the God who transcends all borders. Remember that love, unity, and spiritual vigilance are the true hallmarks of those awaiting the end times, whenever they may come. While acknowledging the turmoil, the false prophets, and the global unrest, we also hold fast to the promise of a new heaven and a new earth. Each culture, each continent, and each believer can bring something uniquely beautiful to the unfolding story of redemption. If we do that, if we embrace our shared heritage rather than being limited by divisions of race or geography, then perhaps we will stand ready when the final trumpet sounds. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If these revelations have resonated with you, take the next step by researching more deeply, investigating early African Christian art or manuscripts, and discussing these insights with your faith community. Compare them with traditional European iconography, noting differences and the messages conveyed, and seek out scholarly works on African theologians like Augustine or Tertullian, whose influence on Christian doctrine was profound. Moreover, consider how these cultural insights might reshape our view of the end times. For if tribulation will affect all humanity, unity is our greatest strength. May each of us find our place in that grand tapestry, secure in the knowledge that, in the eyes of the Almighty, we are all beloved, and that His word holds a place for every face, every culture, and every soul seeking truth.